Hi, this is Dr. P. Recently, I gave some advice to a novice designer about email pitches, and that led me to make this screencast about pitching a tabletop game. And my main thrust here is don't talk much about mechanics when you're pitching a game. Now, there's a caveat here. I work with publishers who usually publish games that are models of something, that clearly represent something, that are not abstract. Abstract games are hard to sell because there's no story attached, and that's why there are many abstract games to which a story is attached. Many Euro-style games amount to that. But publishers vary as much as designers do. So what's appropriate for one is not necessarily appropriate for another. And what I'm talking about is for an email pitch, but most of it applies to an in-person pitch or an over-the-phone pitch. And you might say, isn't the game the mechanics? Well, it's true that I advise people when they're coming up with a game that they have to have mechanics, not just a story or a context. So technically a game is quite a bit mechanics, but practically it is not, because the mechanics are a means to an end, not the end in itself. The end in games is to make an impression on the players or player. And that depends on many things, of which mechanics may be secondary and often are secondary. For example, it depends on the level of player interactivity. It depends on whether or not the game has always correct solutions. Those things are a lot more important than what mechanics are being used. What's important is what the player actually does, and then whether the player enjoys what they're doing. So talk about that in your pitch, not about mechanics, except insofar as the mechanics are relevant to player action. But keep in mind, players rarely think of themselves as doing worker placement or building a deck. They think in terms of winning and of the context of the game. You need to tell a publisher about the components of the game. They need to know how much that game is going to cost to produce, a ballpark estimate. How many cards are in the game? How many dice? What kinds of pieces and how many? A game with 3D pieces is going to cost a lot more to produce than a game with flat pieces, cardboard pieces. Especially if the pitch comes from an unknown designer, there's a very good chance that the game will be too expensive to produce for what it is, because many novice designers have not yet caught on that they can't design a game with whatever components they want. They have to design components to match the game. So, for example, a big selling point of games to publishers is inexpensive components. For example, those games that just use 16 or 20 cards. The publisher wants to know what makes the game unusual. It's the kiss of death to say, for example, it's a deck building game. There are hundreds of deck building games. What sets yours apart? Why would anyone bother with it? The publisher wants to know what makes your game unusual, not what makes it ordinary. Don't say, it's a worker placement game. Oh my God, another one? There may be publishers who like worker placement games, but there are so many around that I suspect a more common reaction is going to be the one I just gave you. When you pitch a game, you are defining the game. This is your opportunity to define what your game is. If your definition as a game designer of your game is that it's a worker placement game or that it's a deck building game, you've already failed. Because there are hundreds of such, and because the mechanic you use is irrelevant to what the game actually does. Now, you may be proud of what you've done to get mechanics to work together to fit harmoniously, but that isn't what the game is about, neither to a player nor to a publisher. So don't talk about mechanics unless you have a unique, surefire mechanic, both of which are very unlikely, understand, because so many other games exist that they've probably used your surefire or unique mechanic. It's not really unique. Now on the next slide I'm going to provide you a list of the items I include in a one-page pitch sheet, which is not the cover letter. There are two things that are maybe approach mechanics, and one is the game type, where I might say something like it's a sweep of history game. But that isn't mechanics, really, is it? Sequence of play could also be called a mechanic, but of course every game has to have one. It's more like it is one of my 10 fundamental structures of games, sequence of play. Keep in mind when you see this list and when I read it to you, these categories are for one-page pitch sheet, not for the cover letter. In the cover letter, I establish my credentials and my interest in this particular publishing company. They want to know that you're interested in them. It's harder to establish your credentials if you don't have a track record. I don't have that problem, fortunately. So here's the list. The title, and of course title may be changed by the publisher, but your title gives some indication of what you think the game is about and so on. A tagline, which is an advertising thing, but which can also tell the publisher quite a bit about the game. Number of players. That's one of the fundamental things about any game. Game length, another fundamental thing. None of those are mechanics, but they're all fundamental. What does the game represent? And what game type is it? And by game type, I mean what category does it fall into? Here you might actually say, if it's just a worker placement game and there's nothing else to it, that it's a worker placement game. But I would hope you'd have something better to say than that. Then the components list, a brief list of what the game requires. Then how to win, because that tells the publisher something about how the game works. What does the player represent? Same idea. Give the publisher a quick idea of how the game works, what it's about. And then what does the player do? And here you can go into some detail if you want. Sequence of play. Part of what happens in the game. Game end. That can be interesting for a variety of reasons. And then attractions for buyers, which is where you can really push what is your unusual selling point or selling points. Then designer, so I have my name on it. And I added afterwards suitability for expansion, because many tabletop games do have expansions these days, and some are more suitable for it than others. So that's what I do, and I make sure that I keep it to one page. Is that ideal? I don't know, but that's how I do it. So when you're pitching, talk about how your game affects the players, what the components are, why you've designed it the way you have, and there you might mention mechanics.